Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Here in Washington on this Friday, it's the day after for President Biden, who seems to be stuck in some kind of political limbo after his news conference last night that by and large focused on foreign policy. He spoke at length about many topics, fielded questions about his age, and almost got through it without gaffing, but not entirely, as this happened in the very first answer he gave at the press conference.
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president.
He did have an earlier stumble in which he was introducing President Zelensky. He called him President Trump, quickly corrected himself. Sorry, Putin. Thank you.
We all do it.
See? I keep saying that. And that's part of the story here. And you wonder if these little gaffes that I can get away with on the air like I just did, and Joe Biden has for 40 years, are still part of the problem that we're talking about now when it comes to stamina, signs of aging. None of that is new for Joe Biden.
No.
And people who know him are kind of used to that. So when we try to delineate between what matters here and what doesn't, we look to the likes of Gregory Korte, Bloomberg politics reporter, who's been knee-deep in all this stuff, including our own polling here. And Gregory, I just wonder, having had a chance to sleep on this, what your view is if Joe Biden's in the same place he was before he walked on stage last night.
Yeah, having slept on it, I kind of think that we're in the same place as we were last night, that he didn't necessarily win over any of the critics from within his own party who have asked him to step aside. But he didn't really do much additional damage either. There were 3 or 4 members of Congress who, after his press conference, did put in their calls and joined the chorus of Democrats asking him to step aside. But you kind of got the impression that those were prepared statements. They were just waiting on the press conference to put those out, and their minds had already been made up. So again, we just kind of have to watch in the coming days to see whether that drumbeat continues. It has been a steady drip, drip, drip over the past couple of weeks. But each time this question comes up to Joe Biden, he is steadfast. He is not getting out of this race. He does not believe that there's anybody who could do any better than him. He does not believe that he's going to lose to Donald Trump at this point. And the polling, as it continues to come in, I think we've seen a little bit of a floor. We've reached a point where the Biden trails probably by no more than 3 percentage points in the national polls, a little bit worse in some of the swing state polls. And so if the bleeding stops, maybe there's only upside as Biden world sees it. But again, we're going to have to wait for more data and more voices to weigh in.
Well, one voice did weigh in kind of today, Gregory, and that would be the House Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, who put out a Dear Colleague letter saying that he met with President Biden yesterday. And to quote Leader Jeffries, in my conversation with Biden, I directly expressed the full breadth of insight, heartfelt perspectives, and conclusions about the path forward that the caucus has shared in our recent time together. What the leader did not say, Gregory, is I told Joe Biden I endorse his reelection run, that others within the caucus want him to stay in this race. How should we read between the lines here?
Yeah, what's really remarkable is that Democrats have given space to dissent within their own party, which is something that you don't see, by the way, on the Republican side. Remember, Donald Trump was indicted, went to trial, and was convicted on 34 felonies, and we heard nary a peep from anyone within the Republican Party that, maybe there should be some consideration that Trump should step aside for a new nominee. And so this is part of what makes the Democratic Party the Democratic Party. It's a little bit messier sometimes. And what I see in that Dear Colleague letter from Hakeem Jeffries is he's really representing the caucus here. He is trying to play the role of a sort of a good faith interlocutor between some of these critics and the White House, and to go to Biden and give him the full breadth of opinion from his caucus, all the way from he needs to get out right now to then I'm a little bit worried. I'd like to see a little bit more strength in the president. To, on the other hand, I'm all in all the way to November. And you see that range of opinions within the Democratic caucuses in Congress.
Gregory, Korte, thank you for joining us. Gregory reporting from Washington here this day after the news conference that, of course, ended the NATO summit. As we looked at Joe Biden at the podium last night, the big 75th anniversary emblem right in front of him. This is a big moment for the alliance. And there was more at play than just Joe Biden's acuity. And we're going to get into a lot of this now. As we heard from the president last evening, he spoke for roughly 1 hour, 59 minutes, and he was asked about what he was hearing, about his age, about his status politically here from world leaders at NATO. Here he is.
I've not had any of my European allies come up to me and say, Joe, don't run. What I hear them say is, you've got to win. You can't let this guy come forward. He'd be a disaster. He'd be a disaster. I mean, I think he said in one of his rallies, don't hold me to this, recently, where NATO, I just learned about NATO, or something to that effect. Foreign policy has never been his strong point.
Joe Biden, of course, making those remarks as he wrapped up the 3-day NATO summit here in Washington. And joining us now is someone who is in town for that summit. The foreign minister of Poland, Sikorski, is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Minister, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's lovely to have you. I wonder what your perception of Joe Biden was, not just in the press conference last night, but over the course of your visit to Washington this week. Do you see a man not only capable of leading a country for another 4.5 years, but effectively leading the free world?
Look, I'm not interfering in your internal affairs. I can tell you that we had a summit with President Biden in March with our president, our prime minister. I was there. We had, I think, 90 minutes of conversation. President Biden was focused, strategic, and quite humorous, actually. Slip-ups happen. You know, I was just meeting with your journalist, and I made a slip-up, and I didn't correct myself. But we need America to lead, and President Biden is leading the effort on Ukraine, for which we are very grateful.
I just used the wrong name on the air before you came in. I did a slip-up, and I do it all the time. We're trying to figure out what counts as a slip and what qualifies as deterioration. And I would ask you, you're not a doctor. We don't have to dwell on your view on that necessarily, but this is a very important moment for the alliance. We're talking about the potential for enormous change here domestically, politically in the United States. There's a lot of noise around the president, as we already know, which could have been a bit of a distraction. But there's also great uncertainty about the trajectory of politics in a number of European nations, having seen elections in France, having seen a change in leadership in the UK. Some are calling this a peak for NATO, that it might not be the same following this moment. How does the alliance survive the uncertainty globally, politically now?
Well, let's unpick what you just said. There's change in the UK, but I am assured by the new government, and the foreign minister visited me at home in Poland on the third day of of him holding office, that Ukraine will be solid. The Britain will be solid on Ukraine, and Prime Minister Starmer reaffirmed that. In France, some people worried that the nationalist side of the politics will take over. That hasn't happened. Putin is constantly counting on our divisions and on our inefficiency, and he doesn't understand our psychology, and he doesn't understand that we are in it for the long haul. Look, as you said, I took part in the summit yesterday. I was impressed at how consistent and powerful and persuasive almost all the leaders of the alliance were in saying we are in it for the long run until Ukraine is a secure, independent nation. And we have some good decisions out of this summit, and President Biden is the author of these good decisions.
Mm-hmm. Well, we don't know that he'll be President Biden beyond January for.
Well, that's democracy for you.
Certainly. And even the president of Poland, President Duda, has told Joe and I that if it does turn out to be a second Donald Trump administration, he can work with Donald Trump. We hear it frequently from other diplomats such as yourself, a willingness to work with whomever. I guess my question is, do you really believe that Donald Trump will be as willing to work with you as President Biden?
We keep in touch with the administration and with the alternative administration, as we do with any other democracy. We have a cohabitation in Poland. The president is from a more Trumpian side of Polish politics, and he's kept in touch with President Trump all along, and we encourage him. I personally, of course, work with the administration, but I talk to President Trump's people, and some of the things that they tell me about what they plan to do are interesting and creative.
Not frightening.
Politics is a difficult business. Some of these things are very controversial. We were disappointed that the American supplemental took so long, but eventually the good thing happened. We hope that President Trump will want to be a winner, and a winner of getting to a fair peace in Ukraine, which means Ukraine enjoying its liberty.
Do you worry about the idea of redefining Article 5, as Donald Trump has suggested, based on the level of financial contribution? Is that a creative idea?
Well, he was right to insist that allies should spend more. And I publicly defended him.
And many have.
Even in style. Because when predecessors did it politely, it didn't work.
How about that?
Okay, so the combination of President Trump's and Joe Biden's pressure and the war in Ukraine resulted in the fact that 23 out of the 32 allies now spend 2% of GDP on defense. Poland spends 4%. And we are going to spend 5 next year. We are number 1 in NATO, including the United States, in proportion, obviously, because we are no longer in eternal post-Cold War peace. But to think about, so this is a good thing, and that was needed. But an alliance is not a neighborhood security company. Take Iceland, which is a NATO member, which hardly has a defense budget at all, but it has other vital assets. Its territory, its ability to refuel, to bring. When we rallied around the United States, when countries were spending under 2%, we sent first Poland, 1 brigade to Afghanistan, another brigade to Iraq. Others did the same. So the level of spending shouldn't be the only yardstick.
Just in our final moment with you, something else that came out of this summit was the labeling of China as a decisive enabler of Russia. And we also know that Donald Trump is quite hawkish toward China, as is Joe Biden for that matter. And I wonder if, to you, whatever the outcome of the election, does it seem that the U.S. is orienting more toward that adversary, leaving Europe to be the one who has to step up defense militarily against the threat of Russia?
Sequencing matters. If we enable Ukraine to win, to defend its independence and borders in the next couple of hours, then I think other theaters could become a priority. And actually helping Ukraine win, I believe, would also moderate China's behavior. China is respecting our thickest red line, which is not to send arms to Russia, unlike Iran or North Korea. And yes, China could actually bring their vassal Putin to heel and tell him to end this war. And we are making these representations to the Chinese leadership, and I hope they act on them.
We've enjoyed staying in touch with you, and I hope that you'll continue to factor us into your plans when you return to Washington. Thank you for joining us on this NATO Summit week. The Foreign Minister of Poland, Radoslaw Sikorski, back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. With the summit in our rearview mirror, so too is the news conference that had so many people talking so much going into it. We now have the analysis coming out of it with Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Our signature panel is up next. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
4 weeks, over 2 weeks to be exact, the conversation that has dominated all of political thought is whether or not Joe Biden is sticking it out and will become, next month, the Democratic nominee in this election cycle, as a growing number of Democrats have called for him to step aside. Now, 18 congressional Democrats, as of the last count, have done so. And the question is not just, can Joe Biden stop the bleeding, but has there been too much bleeding already? This is something we spoke with Charlie Cook of the famed Cook Political Report about last night, just ahead of Biden's presser.
I think the president's lost control of events here. And, it's not really a question of whether, it's sort of when and how, and I think it's going to be pretty soon. It's just starting to tumble out of control, and I don't think there's any stopping it. I think, it's just a matter of days or hours or something.
Sounding a lot like Rick Davis to me. As we assembled our panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, it was, Kailey, the night of the debate when Rick sat with us at this table and essentially said that. Now that we have Jeanne Zaino back in the fold this week, she too agrees that Joe Biden will eventually need to step down in this case. And I'll point you both. Welcome, Rick and Jeanne. Following a late night here on Bloomberg TV and radio, a Dear Colleague letter sent this morning by House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. He met with the president. Says he expressed the full breadth of insight, heartfelt perspectives, and conclusions about the path forward that the caucus has shared in our recent time together. Jeanne, how difficult was that meeting for Joe Biden?
It had to be terribly difficult on both sides. I mean, imagine being the minority leader and having to share the number of people Kailey was just talking about. And I was hearing, thinking back, Kailey last night was saying a dozen, then it crept up to 15. Now it's at 18. It's not going in the right direction. And, I think it's important to put the context here, like Charlie Cook was talking about. This is an issue of a path forward. And I am really struck by this piece by Democrat Doug Sosnick, who is talking about the fact that Joe Biden's path to the presidency for a re-election has all but vanished, and Trump is the clear winner. And you go through the numbers that he's laying out. And again, this is a Democrat, and he says he's never seen such a grim electoral college landscape for Biden. And it gets worse from there. But the bottom line is this predates the debate, which was horrifying enough. There's a reason that they wanted the debate in June, to stop the bleeding. And of course, as we all saw, it made it worse. And so he is in a position now when his path forward has become just one real path, and that is through the Rust Belt. That's why he's going to be in Michigan today. But it is a very narrow path for him and opening up for Trump, exactly opposite of what the Democrats want and need.
Well, in addition to his trip to Michigan, we understand, based on a number of outlets reporting, that Biden's going to be meeting with a number of key groups on the Hill today as well, or at least virtually: the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, the New Dems. It seems that he is still trying to do this outreach, Rick, but is it too far gone, considering that the majority of those 18 that we have talked about who have publicly called for him to step aside generally are white? They aren't these coalitions of color that we know were key to Joe Biden's victory in 2020.
Yeah, it's really phenomenal. Rearguard action 1 month from your convention. It's amazing that we find ourselves in this position with an incumbent president. All the advantages of incumbency has vanished for Joe Biden. If anything, it's a burden. And he's carrying that burden around, frankly, a burden he can't lift. So this is really phenomenal. I mean, you've got a guy who is struggling to prosecute a campaign against Donald Trump and has struggled all year with that, and now has the additional burden of having to backfill his support amongst core constituency groups. These are people who should be voting for Joe Biden 95% of the time. And he's using scarce resources, his time, campaign efforts, to try and shore up his base a month before his party's convention. It's a phenomenally difficult position, one I have not seen in modern political history. This was, Ronald Reagan never had this problem. George Bush never had this problem. Bill Clinton never had this problem. I mean, there were people who had to firm up their base, but never to the degree where you spend a Friday afternoon after a NATO summit, basically begging, the various caucuses in Congress not to bolt on you. It's really shocking and historic. What we're seeing is the melting down of an entire party to the degree that Joe Biden can take them down with him. And that's why people are coming out publicly and saying, please reconsider, get out of the race, because they see the drag on the party writ large, not just his campaign. And that is even more important, that if Donald Trump is president, the congressional Democratic Party needs to be healthy.
This is all happening, of course, Rick, as MAGA packs up from Milwaukee. We've got a convention that starts on Monday. I suspect we could get some news this weekend, potentially, on a vice presidential pick. This whole convention is beginning to take form. Reports suggest Donald Trump Jr. will have a primetime speaking slot to introduce the VP, whoever that may be. He's good friends with a senator from Ohio. I know that much. The mayor of East Palestine, Ohio, Trent Conway, is going to be speaking. So, too, apparently, well, at least attending, will be Melania Trump. It's unclear if she's going to actually have a speaking role. Dana White, another name that we're hearing about. Jeanne, Joe Biden's going to be sitting down with Lester Holt, NBC News, on Monday. He's got travel plans throughout the week. Does he stick with them?
I think he absolutely should. He should be out as much as possible. My view is he should have been out before and after the debate performance in that way. I don't know that it is going to stem the tide. I do think it is very interesting to hear that Donald Trump Jr. is going to be introducing the VP nominee, which leads me to conclude, although I have no basis for this, that it won't be Marco Rubio, because, of course, Donald Trump Jr. has said that would be a choice to give Republicans in the Senate incentive to impeach his father so that they could get Marco Rubio in the seat. I mean, just shocking thing to say. But you've got to imagine that if Donald Trump Jr. is doing this introduction, that Marco Rubio may not be amongst the top three that we've been hearing about. I don't know, but that's my conclusion, hearing he's making that introduction.
Of course, we just still don't know. We don't know when we will find out. We do know the convention starts Monday. What we also don't know, Rick, is whether or not this ticket, Donald Trump and whoever, is actually going to be up against a Biden-Harris ticket, or if something could realistically change. We touched on this a bit during our special coverage last night, Rick, but how unusual is that? If you're the Trump campaign, you're attaching someone else to your ticket and not knowing that this is actually the ticket that is going to do as well against whomever if Biden doesn't become the nominee.
Yeah, it's kind of like running against a ghost. You really don't know who's going to walk through that door, come their convention. So, yeah, you just got to package the best you can. Look, they've sliced and diced the electorate that's available to vote for Trump, right? I mean, these are very slim margins that will determine this election. So, certain kinds of suburban voters, certain kinds of, young male blacks, certain kinds of Hispanic voters, and they've matched up the various contestants against those voting groups that are most likely to go for Trump in a competitive election. They may leave something out because the ticket may change, but this is a pretty well defined election, regardless of who's at the top of the ticket, on the Democratic side. So they can be very confident that they're putting together a package that they think is the best, ticket to go forward and try to appeal to these constituencies. So I don't think they worry about it a lot. Frankly, they're probably high-fiving each other right now as they roll into Milwaukee, because they've got a situation where today, as we've been talking about, Joe Biden is spending more time trying to shore up his base than attack Donald Trump. And that's a good day for Donald Trump. Every single day that occurs between now and Election Day, that is the standard. It's advantage Trump.
Advantage Trump with some counter programming from Joe Biden. It'll be interesting to see what takes place next week. It'll all unfold right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Both Rick and Jeanne are going to be traveling with us this weekend for special coverage that will last through the week. We're going to be meeting you back here noontime Monday from Milwaukee. Kailey, Leinz, myself, our signature panel, and we'll have special coverage on the nominating speech Thursday evening when we actually see Donald Trump on the stage. Rick and Jeanne, safe travels. We'll see you a little bit later on the late edition of Balance of Power, and of course again in Milwaukee on Monday.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
As we read the Dear Colleague letter from Hakeem Jeffries, who met with Joe Biden last night, and pretty clear that this probably was not a very fun meeting, as he expressed in his words the full breadth of insight, heartfelt perspectives, and conclusions about the path forward that the caucus has shared in our recent time together. He did not call on Joe Biden to withdraw from the race. And Kailey, he's said repeatedly, including at the podium yesterday, that he is not going to betray the trust of his members as long as this conversation is ongoing. He's going to essentially remain on the sidelines as he's dealing with a couple of different factions. And by the way, the faction calling for Joe Biden to step down remains pretty small.
Yeah.
At a 213, we're still not even at 20.
No, only 18 congressional Democrats have called for Joe Biden to leave the race, at least publicly. The question is, what is the true nature of the conversations that are happening behind closed doors and within the family, as the Democratic leader was alluding to in that letter?
Yes, absolutely. We have to acknowledge, though, that there were reports, including some here at Bloomberg, that a letter could be sent today following the NATO summit with dozens of Democratic House members on it. And Kailey, we have not seen that yet.
No, we haven't. And we have a lot of questions for the Democrats in the House that we haven't heard call for Joe Biden to resign, including the one we're speaking to next. I'm pleased to say joining us is Congressman John Garamendi, the Democrat from California. Sir, welcome back to Bloomberg. Always lovely to have you on Balance of Power. First, we'd like to wish you well, as you've shared this week that you have been diagnosed with cancer. How are you feeling?
Excellent. Ready to go. Just have to be away from people to avoid getting an infection. But I'm in great health, and we're going to whip this thing in the next 3 to 5 months. The really good news is extraordinary progress has been made dealing with multiple myeloma as well as others. And guess what? Using the president's words, guess what? Remember the Biden moonshot? It is one of the ways in which the research is helping me. So thank you, Joe Biden.
Well, that's remarkable to hear. Congressman, you've been on our minds as a frequent voice here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and we appreciate you sharing that with us. And we do hope that you're well, because we're having a difficult conversation about aging right now in Washington. Yep. You are supporting Joe Biden through this time, and I wonder if you can explain to our viewers and listeners why, because we're hearing from voices, Congressman, every day telling us that it's already over.
Well, it is not over at all. In fact, anybody that's been paying attention and not listening to the feeding frenzy would realize, yes, Joe Biden had a very bad debate, no doubt about it. However, Donald Trump had a worse debate. He refused to answer any questions, lied repeatedly, as is his tendency to do that. Remember during his 4 years in office, 30,000 lies? Well, he added up a few more during that debate. The fact of the matter is, after that debate, the president has been very, very strong, both on the stump, ad-libbing, off of the teleprompter, absolutely strong. And 3 days with NATO leaders, we're talking about an assembly of more than 25 NATO leaders that worked with the president over the previous 3 days, and then the press conference yesterday. If you were looking for problems in the press conference, hey, you found 2 flubs. Big deal. We'll undoubtedly have a flub or 2 of my own on this, and maybe even 1 or 2 of yours. But the reality is he went through an entire litany of international affairs, from China to Russia, the Philippines, the Pacific, and NATO. He did all of that in depth and proving that he's on top of the issues, including the domestic issues. So what's the problem here? The problem here is a bad debate and a whole bunch of willy-nillys that are scared to death of their own shadow. We have a very seasoned president that can carry on. Can he do it for 4 years? Tell you and I, are we going to be around for 4 years? We never know the day. But we do know that we have a great team because we have a vice president that is ready to go should it ever be necessary.
Well, Congressman, I appreciate what you're saying about the debate being a singular bad night. Certainly, that is what we have heard from the president. The fact is, though, polling has showed and has done consistently that the vast majority of Americans just think President Biden is too old to serve. Many more than think the same about Donald Trump, who is just 3 years younger. And I wonder if it's a question of whether these all need to be mutually exclusive. Is it not possible that President Biden could have the chops on foreign policy, could be an honest, good man, as clearly you believe him to be, and still not be the best person to beat Donald Trump in November?
No, that's incorrect. What we have is a president that over the previous 3.5 years has proven that he's on top of all of the issues, including this week. This is not something that is new for him. This week, dealing with the heads of state, NATO heads of state, he proved to them and anybody that cared to listen to what the outcome of that meeting was, he proved that he is on top of the issue and that he is the leader for the free world. Bottom line, he proved that to all of those heads of state that attended the NATO conference. That's this week. Now, going forward, he's also shown that he can handle the press. He did that with skill, with determination, and with a great deal of insight and information. For more than an hour, he stood. Now, just 3 weeks ago, we had the White House picnic. We're talking about 90-degree heat. We're talking about Republicans with their families, Democrats with their families, lined up to greet the president. And he worked that rope line for more than an hour and a half. And those that were last in line got the same effort, the same energy, the same greeting that those that were first in line. This man can do it, and he has shown it. What he has not been able to overcome is the feeding frenzy. But that will also happen in the days ahead as he continues, probably in the next couple of hours, in Michigan. Once again, showing anybody that cares to listen and honestly evaluate that he is capable, that he's on the game. Now, what is not being considered is that he has a team, not only his staff, but he has a vice president who has been with him for 3.5 years now, and has proven herself to be very capable. International affairs, international travel, understanding the world around it, understanding domestic, and importantly, pointing out that Trump will take away the fundamental rights that women once had before Trump put into office the most conservative Supreme Court perhaps in the history of America. That's what Trump did. And Kamala Harris is out there pointing out to the world and pointing out to American women, beware of another 4 years of Trump, because Project 2025 has clearly stated that they're going to take away nationally the right to women's health care.
Well, and that's something that Joe Biden's talking about today in Detroit is 2025. You mentioned Kamala Harris, obviously from California. A lot of folks are looking at the vice president now for obvious reasons, Congressman. You can speak to her veracity as a candidate, but I have to ask you, and I wouldn't say this, wouldn't ask this of just anyone, but if we're being honest here, you're right in the middle of these two guys when it comes to age. Donald Trump is 78, Joe Biden is 81. And this has been compared, this idea of a cognitive test, to taking away the car keys from an older member of your family. And I think a lot of people can relate with how complicated and difficult that is.
Wait a minute.
Do you think that both of these candidates should agree to a cognitive test what's good for one is good for the other.
If there's going to be a cognitive test, let's not have a kindergarten cognitive test, which is what Trump continually talks about. If there's going to be a cognitive test, yes, both should. But I would like to see Donald Trump stand in front of the international press corps, as Biden did yesterday, and answer the questions, answer the detailed questions about international relationships, detailed questions about national security. And I'd like him also to explain to the international press why he spent 4 years as president, basically tearing apart NATO and handing the keys to Putin. And I remember the press conference in Helsinki. I remember what happened there. And all of us, now that we have Russia invading Ukraine, all of us should be aware of what's going on. And oh, by the way, who did Trump meet with yesterday in Mar-a-Lago? He met with Orban. Mm-hmm. Who did Orban meet with a week ago? Putin. Isn't it interesting that Orban meets with Putin and then meets with Trump? What are those two guys dealing with right now? What are they up to? What do we have to look forward to? Oh, I remember very well what happened to Jimmy Carter when Reagan and his troops cut a deal with the Iran Ayatollah and leaving Jimmy Carter to hang out there. And what happened 3 months after Reagan became president? Yeah, we had the Iran-Contra deal. That's what we had. So what is Trump up to? What is Orban up to? You need to ask those questions of those two characters. And by the way, you and I saw Biden immediately as the run-up to the Ukraine war, rallying the support for Ukraine, rallying NATO, putting NATO back together again, and adding Finland and Sweden. That is what the President of the United States did during his tenure. Can he carry on? He gave every indication yesterday that he can. And if somewhere along the way, and every single one of us is subject to this, whether you are Kamala Harris's age, or whether you're your age or you're 17 years of age, we don't know when our day will arrive. But should it arrive, should it ever arrive, for the very best quarterback that we could put on the field in the run-up to the most important political Super Bowl of all, that would be Biden. But if he can't carry on for whatever reason, then we have Harris. And I've worked with Harris since 1992, when she was the district attorney for San Francisco. We were going after bad guys then, as insurance commissioner and as city attorney. She is competent, capable, smart, and she's not going to be pushed around. And she is out there campaigning today on behalf of American women. So let's look at this. We have a team. We have a great quarterback.
Yeah.
Proven
We're
quarterback.
just about out of time, Congressman.
This past day. I know I'm going to have to shut this down, but I've only begun to push for Biden and what we need to do.
He's closing the place today. Congressman John Garamendi, thank you, Congressman, for answering our questions. We only ever wish we had more time. This is Bloomberg. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.